So we get conversing as we return on the AM show on Ghana's rank on the World Democracy Index, which has reduced from 54th position with an overall score of 6.75% in 2016 to 59th position with an overall score of 6.50 in 2020. Now you look at the difference in there. In 2021, Ghana maintained a score of 6.50 with a 56th position ranking. Now, the Rule of Law Index, and there are a number of indexes to look at, also shows that Ghana has reduced from 44th position with a score of 0.58 in 2016 to 58th position with a score of 0.55 in 2021. We ask, what does this mean for the democratic practice and the governance of our country? Now, joining us for the discussion is Dr. John Osai Kwapong, Democracy and Development Fellow with the CDD Ghana. Dr. Kwapong, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us on the AM show.
Good morning to you as well, and thanks for having me.
A great pleasure. Let's start off. What is your quick reflection on these two? The Democracy Index, where we are actually described as a flawed democracy, just above the hybrid systems in Africa. And when it comes to the Rule of Law Index, where it appears we are not getting things right. What is your initial reaction to the two?
I think overall it goes to show you that democracy is not a one-time done deal, that it's always a work in progress, right? I think if you look back to the third wave of democratization that happened around 89, 1990, that blew across the sub-Saharan African continent, where a lot of the countries began to make transitions from whatever systems were in place, most of which were either one-party states or military regimes, to democratization. There was a lot of euphoria that greeted, that greeted a lot of the initial successful elections, even though some of them had challenges. But I think when you look at these indices and how countries perform over time, for me, the bigger point is that democracy is never a done deal, that it is always a work in progress.
Let me just ask this question, especially as we're broaching the subject of democracy. Interestingly, yesterday I met someone in the political fray, and we had a discussion on this self-same matter, democracy. Do you feel that even the brand of it that we practice in Ghana, and let me just take you back, in the Greek polis, the city-state, and what they call democracy, all involving democracy with everybody on board, is very different from what the United States has couched for itself, the UK, France, the Western countries. But in each of these instances, you would realize, even in India, that there is a context, a cultural, even socio-political context to their democracy. Have we achieved that in Ghana, even before we expand on this bit? Because it appears we're just speaking, democracy. So it's the generality of it, the practice of it, but it's not homegrown, and that is why we are even so scared from time to time when there's a lot of cool talk and all of that, because the systems, the structures are not well established. Your take?
So if the Professor Kwame Gyekye once said in his, he wrote a very fascinating book called Tradition versus Modernity, Moral and Philosophical Thoughts on the African Experience. But in there, he talks about what democracy really means. And he defines democracy as it is also something that we must have some sort of cultural affinity to, something that we are prepared to defend. And so there's always a challenge between how we design the systems and the institutions, right, and how those systems and institutions actually play out in practice. And there are sometimes you see these sort of cultural underpinnings, right? So, for example, you design an institution that, let's say, guarantees the demand for accountability from leaders and institutions, right? But if I think of my growing up experience in Ghana, there's also that cultural underpinning where sometimes there's some hesitation in terms of how you treat your elders, right? And so, how do you translate some of those cultural norms that have persisted for a long time into a modern governance system where that notion of quote unquote someone being an elder and therefore must be treated with care, how you treat them publicly, even when they have erred. Sometimes it's something you bring them behind closed doors and have other elders address any infractions that they may have. So it's a challenge, and as time goes on, we have to develop what I call habits of the heart, right? Things that, so you just don't have democracy in name or, institutions, but you also develop the practices, the habits, the behaviors, the norms that you are able to reconcile with that democratic dispensation that you have, and that's a real challenge. And as I keep saying, it's something you have to keep working on, because you never arrive at that. We are there. The work is done. Now we have a democracy.
Right. My colleague Samuel Kojo Brace is also here. He'll be coming in shortly, but I just wanted to find out before he comes in with his own take on all of this. We are described by the latest report as a flawed democracy. There are hybrid regimes or democracies across the continent which are faring even worse, like Benin, among other entities. In fact, only Mauritius is given sort of a clean sheet in terms of democratic practice, and about some 4, 5, 6 countries falling into the flawed democracy zone. But how do you react to these categorizations? And basically, what does this mean for us as a flawed democracy? What does this mean?
Right. And we've been categorized as a flawed democracy in this Economic Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, I think, since 2008.
Right.
So consistently, we've been characterized as a flawed democracy. And if you look at the different categories that make up the overall score that puts us within the range of a flawed democracy, you would notice that we do well on electoral participation and pluralism, right? So you have the political parties. We've been able to have 8 successful elections. Yes, some of it has come with some challenges, but generally we've had 8 successful elections. You've had some of those elections that have resulted in a change of government, from opposition to a ruling party, etc., etc. So those we seem to have at least established a good rhythm around. The other things that keeps pulling us down, at least from my analysis of the trend data,
right,
is in areas of the functioning of government in terms of our ability to implement policy for it to actually achieve the desired results, and also some of the questions around civil liberties. So
right,
that's part of the challenge. The other thing too is I'm also not surprised that we are, quote unquote, characterized as a flawed democracy, because if you look at Afrobarometer, there's a question on the extent of democracy in the country. And Ghanaians have always gone, except for 2008, where the perception was that we were a full democracy. Generally, the public opinion in that Afrobarometer survey has always shifted between a democracy with major problems or a democracy with minor problems. So again, it goes back to my point of there's work to be done. I mean, surprisingly, I think it was 2017 or 2016, the US was moved from a full democracy to a flawed democracy.
Right. I recall that, and it was a very thorny.
Is that indication that you have to constantly work to build stronger institutions, a strong political culture that is able to make your democracy flourish the extent to which we all hope that it actually flourishes and works.
Doc, could you brace here? What do you think is what inhibiting us? Doc, could you brace here? What do you think is what is preventing us from developing our democracy to that level where we'll be out of this bracket and to be described as a flourishing one?
I think that if you look at the categories, I think, and yesterday I was actually plotting where we've seen some reds. Okay, so the two main, at least from this democracy index, the two things that I think are working against us is in the area of what they call the functioning of government. And I always say that democracy is also not just an end, but it's a means to an end. And that end is not just the delivery of political goods, right? So democracy is good that it can guarantee you certain political goods, the right to vote, right to free speech, right to assembly, to protest, etc., etc. All of those things are great. But I also believe that democracy must also translate into the delivery of social and economic goods, right? The bread and butter issues. Because when those bread and butter issues are missing, people link it back to how well or not your political system is functioning. And if that political system in place is a democracy, then there's that question of, well, are we getting everything we expect, from democracy beyond just, the basic, political rights that we also cherish? So that's the one area that, and even in Afrobarometer, it's the one area that always continues to show that there's a lot more that we can deliver. The civil liberties arena is also the one area that keeps hitting us. And if you look at the questions that the EIU does ask to construct your score on civil liberties, the questions around protest, the ability to protest freely, no institutional blocks against certain expressions, free media, free print media, things like that. I think sometimes some of the situations that may come up in terms of how the system has treated dissent or have reacted to certain things within the media space, etc., etc. I think are some of those things that continue to hurt us, particularly in the democracy index.
How much of this is attributed to how we started, how we began our democracy, so that learning from that could help us develop and move on to be better?
Yes, so you're right. We made a transition from a different political arrangement, right? So a military regime of quite a number of, for about 11, 12 years before we made this transition, right? And so if you think about it, for 11, 12 years, you've been under a particular trajectory and have developed a certain behavior and political attitude, right? And so once there's this new dispensation, it takes quite a bit to warm up to the new reality. But it also takes quite a bit for the new system or for the system to also readjust to the new reality. Right. I always say that, for example, we are a little hesitant in sharing information in terms of government information, right? I recall some of my experiences doing my research and seeking information from public institutions, and you get this initial, when you're requesting some information, this sort of, what do you want that information for, right? And that is something that is a holdover from a in which information is closely guarded. So now we are slowly making that transition to more transparency, more making sure that we shine light on a lot of the kinds of information that we can share with the public. Now you have an RTI. Even with that RTI, we are slowly in terms of getting it to really work, things like that. So there is that holdover from what our political culture and what our institutional culture has been to this new era of democratization. And again, it's going to take a lot of work year in, year out to make sure that we really get there.
But Doc, do you foresee that year in, year out, we are adding on to improving how our democracy is? Do you foresee that? Learning from where we've come from to where we are?
So for example, I just used the example of the RTI, right, as one small example of the way we are trying to reshape institutions. So if you go back, for example, to the Kufuor era, right, some of the governance reforms was supposed to reshape some of these institutions, further open up the system, right? That is why you would see in 2008 Afrobarometer, the perception being that we are now, quote unquote, a full democracy, right? And then that changes at some point. I think we keep taking steps, but I also think that there are new realities and new challenges that will continuously come up, that will demand that we really have to rethink what these new challenges mean and how we deal with it as a matter of policy or as a matter of politics, right? So, for example, if you look at the new configuration of the current 8th Parliament and the issues that it is bringing up, these were things that 4 years ago we didn't even worry about because we've never had a parliamentary composition that way. For me, how you deal with these challenges when they come up is critical in terms of the precedents you set and the trajectory you place yourself on for the next 5, 10, 15 years of your democratic practice. And I think we really do have a lot of work to do. It's not easy. Tensions would always come up between how you balance some of these issues in a democracy. But for me, we've come far enough that the choice that we have is how can we continue on this path through the choices we make, whether it's through our court system, whether it's through the laws that Parliament passes, whether it's the policies that the executive proposes and forces. Those are the things that we have to keep working on.
Dr. Kwapon, so a quick one. When you take a look at the list, all regions of the world suffered some battering, a bit of a battering. Apart from Eastern Europe, Western Europe fell just marginally, but all other regions, Latin America, Africa, suffered a battering. I'm just taking a look at the regime types across the world, and this is what I see. The full democracies are just 21. That is 12.6% of countries, or if you look at the world population, 6.4. Flawed democracies are 53, that is 31.7 percentage of the country component. Hybrid regimes, 34, that is 20.4%. And authoritarian regimes, the largest, 59, with 35.3. So very briefly, in maybe a minute or less, so we talk about the human rights angle of it. How do you feel this reflects, and what more should we be looking at very briefly to get ourselves into the best category of full democracies?
Right. And if so every year you see these themes that the Democracy Index comes up with when they release the report. And you really do see that going all the way back in 2008, democracy has been facing some major challenges, right? From 2008 being described as democracy in stagnation to 2019, for example, being described as setbacks and popular protest, democracy under stress, democracy at a standstill, goes to show you that certain systems, certain political behaviors endure much stronger than sometimes we think. And so, as I've alluded to before, we must constantly be keeping watch on the signals that we get from these indices and the things that it points out to us to pay attention to. I always say that, for example, it behoves on us to pay attention to a survey like the Afrobarometer survey because of the signal that it sends to us in terms of the areas in our democratic dispensation that needs work. If you look at this democracy index, I will take the same approach, which is if you look at how many are hybrid regimes, how many are authoritarian regimes, if you look at your own country scores, for me, the takeaway is what are the signals that it's sending you about your own system and the work that you need to do to even strengthen your institutions. Because you can see that, again, there's always this pressure that comes to bear on your democratic institutions that you can slip in and out of being in a good place where they are considered strong or being in a bad place where they are considered that you're losing some ground in certain key areas.
Doc, earlier, if you look at this document, it said the Democracy Index 2021, it says, Canada's score fell slightly compared with 2020 owing to an April 2021 ruling by the Quebec Superior Court to uphold the province's recent ban on wearing religious symbols in certain public service jobs. So question is, if you look at how our judiciary has come under some criticism of late, how does that play us maybe in the next round? Or how do we handle it such that it doesn't take us a little further downwards?
Right. And that is where, so you don't want a judiciary saying, okay, I'm going to rule based on how people are going to react, right? Mm-hmm. That I would interpret the law and rule based on, the law, precedents, et cetera, et cetera. Mm. But at the same time, how certain rulings occur and the reasons behind the rulings and public reaction and public perceptions also has a way of shaping people's attitudes towards these institutions. So you're right. So if you look at a landmark case like that in the case of Canada, you can see how in the expect ratings in this index, it might raise some red flags. And,
right.
and again, so you think about some of the rulings that have come out in a place like Ghana that has, created not so much positive public reaction. You start to wonder, for example, in the next democracy index, how much of that is right. going to shape our perceptions of the judiciary.
Right. Dr. Kwapong, so very briefly, we're practically out of time, very briefly on this bit. So the human rights aspects or the rule of law aspect, and interestingly, we've spoken about even the right to information and all of that. We have not only stagnated, we have lost points in that respect. Briefly, in some 40 seconds, your quick reaction.
That's concerning because at the heart of democracy is this notion of the rule of law, that no one is above the law, institutions work to protect everybody's interests, they adjudicate issues fairly and openly, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for me, it's a signal that we also, again, must ask ourselves, what is it that we're doing or not doing that is causing us to, decline in such an area as the rule of law?
Doc, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining the conversation. Dr. John Kwapong, of course, Democracy Fellow with the CDD. We're so grateful that you joined us this morning.
And thank you for having me.
Great. So Sam, right before we go, we all know water is life. Water regulates your body temperature and keeps you alive and kicking. Awake is premium purified treated water through a strict purification process to ensure that every bottle on the market refreshes you better. We have the perfect sizes for all occasions, 330 ml and 500 ml to fit right into your pocket or bag, 750 ml for the heavy drinkers, and 1.5 liters for those who always want more. I've introduced our special 19-liter jars for offices and homes. Now, you just need to stay awake with Awake Purified Drinking Water wherever you go. So come on, grab a bottle of Awake water and get quality hydration. Awake Purified Drinking Water, one for life. Remember, for every bottle you purchase, an amount is donated to the National Cardiothoracic Center. It's produced by Casapreco. If you want bulk purchases, please call 0262 351 251. And before we go, did you know that the income of a young entrepreneur from some selected businesses is exempt from tax for 5 years? Any young entrepreneur engaged in manufacturing, information and communications technology, agro-processing, energy production, waste processing, tourism and the creative arts, as well as horticulture and medicinal plants, does not need to pay income tax on these activities for their first 5 years of operation. A young entrepreneur engaged in business that enjoys an initial 5-year concession benefits from the following applicable tax rates for 5 years. Are you ready? Accra and Tema, 15%. Other regional capitals outside the 3 northern regions, 12.5%. Outside the other regional capitals, 10%. And in the 3 northern regions, 5%. So for further clarity and information, contact your nearest GRA office. Ghana Revenue Authority, integrity, fairness, and service. Now, also remember, before we go, you have to pay income tax on any income you earn in Ghana, even when you do not live in Ghana. When you earn any income through a business transaction, income tax must be paid by the business by withholding the tax amount and paying same to the GRA on your behalf. It's happened to me, and that is the law. Well, thank you for joining us on the AM show. Sam.
Ben.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining me as well.
Thanks for having me today.
All right.
Thanks to our awesome viewers.
Exactly.
That's all the time to know.
Good Friday to you, and well, have a blessed Easter.